Last time we spoke about the invasion of Iwo Jima. General LeMay's B-29 bombers targeted Japan, inflicting heavy damage on Kobe at Oda's Nakajima factory, though at a cost of many lost aircraft. Meanwhile, U.S. forces prepared for the Iwo Jima assault. On February the 19th, Marines landed amidst intense bombardment, facing fierce Japanese resistance. Progress was slow, with heavy casualties. By the 21st, they fought to capture Mount Suribachi. Amidst the chaos, kamikaze attacks struck American carriers, causing significant losses and foreshadowing the brutal battles that lay ahead. In the midst of the relentless rain on February the 22nd, Colonel Liversedge led the 28th Marines in a fierce assault upon Mount Suribachi, facing determined Japanese resistance. Despite harsh conditions and significant casualties, the Marines pushed forward. On February the 23rd, they reached the summit, raising the American flag to symbolize their hard-earned victory. The Secretary of the Navy, inspired by the moment, declared it would ensure the Marine Corps' legacy for centuries to come. As the battles continued, the Marines would face heavy losses, but they remained resolute in their mission. This episode is The Fall of Manila. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. Before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on all major podcast platforms. And if you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Last week, as we were observing in Manila, General Griswold's forces had effectively confined the remnants of Admiral Uribachi's troops in the Intramuros, the Southport area, and the Philippine Commonwealth government buildings located at the southern edge of the walled city. Available information led to the conclusion that the Japanese defenses were the strongest at the southern and eastern sides of the walled city, and that the Japanese expected to be attacked from these directions. Japanese garrisons in the legislative, finance, and agricultural buildings just across the Padre Burgos Street, southeast of the Intramuros, could cover these approaches. The 37th Division could, of course, take the government buildings before launching an assault on the Intramuros, but it would be easier to attack the government buildings after the Intramuros fell. Conversely, planners deemed it feasible to strike into Intramuros from the west, since Japanese defenses along the west wall, across Bonifacio Street, from the Manila Hotel and the Southport area, appeared pretty weak. But in this case, American troops would have to first clear out the Southport area, and then, advancing from the west, would have to attack towards much of their own supporting artillery. The artillery's best positions for close support were on the north and northeast, across the Pasig River, and on the east in the area south from the General Post Office to the City Hall, and much of the artillery ultimately did fire from these areas. About halfway from the northeast to the northwest corner of the Intramuros, the ancient wall ended, providing direct access into the walled city at the government mint. The only other obstacle on the north was a low seawall running along the south bank of the Pasig River, and the Japanese defenses along the north face appeared weak except at the northeast corner. Planners therefore decided that there would be an excellent chance to execute a successful amphibious assault from the north bank of the Pasig River against the north-central side of the walled city. Given that the Japanese defenses were the strongest on the southern and eastern sides of the walled city, and that the ancient wall ended at the government mint between the northeast and northwest corners of the Intramuros, it was decided to initiate an amphibious attack from the north bank of the Pasig River, targeting the north-central section of the walled city, executed by the 129th Regiment with close artillery support. However, aware that the Japanese had established a complex tunnel system for rapid troop movement within Intramuros, General Beitler decided it was essential to conduct a secondary assault on the Quezon Gate, near the northeastern entrance, to keep the Japanese forces off balance and to split their attention. Since the Japanese had fortified this area with strong pillboxes just inside the walls, the division concluded that heavy artillery would be required to create an additional breach in the thick wall just south of Quezon Gate, where the 145th Regiment would launch its attack. Furthermore, as the Japanese could target the advancing troops with enfilade fire from 3 government buildings to the south, Allied artillery would need to neutralize these buildings during the assault on Intramuros. Lastly, the First Cavalry Brigade, positioned to the west and southwest of Intramuros, would block any potential escape routes for Japanese forces from the walled city. Thus far, General MacArthur had severely restricted the employment of air in the metropolitan area. In late January and early February, Marine Corps SPDs had bombed and strafed a few pinpointed targets in the north and south port areas, and had also hit some obvious Japanese gun positions in the areas of the Luneta Park and Burnham Green. 1 or 2 strikes may have also taken place against specific targets within Intramuros, but all in all, it appears that planes of the Allied Air Forces flew no more than 10 or 12 individual sorties against targets within the city after February the 3rd. Before that time, both carrier-based and land-based aircraft had presumably limited their strikes to targets within the port areas and to the oil storage facilities in the Padacan and Paco districts. Of course, some bombs had gone astray during these strikes and had caused damage within Intramuros, while additional damage within the walled city had resulted from both American and Japanese artillery within the first 2 weeks of the Battle for Manila. When approached with General Griswold's plan to carry out an intensive aerial bombardment against the walled city, MacArthur once again objected. The use of air on part of the city occupied by a friendly and allied population is unthinkable. The inaccuracy of this type of bombardment would result beyond a question of death of thousands of innocent civilians. It is not believed, moreover, that this would appreciably lower our own casualty rate, although it would unquestionably hasten the conclusion of the operations. For these reasons, I do not approve the use of air bombardment on the Intramuros district. However, General MacArthur had previously issued orders limiting air operations in the metropolitan area, leading him to reject this proposal. Not wanting to rely solely on infantry for the assault, Griswold and Beitler decided to reorganize a significant artillery preparation, as they were not explicitly prohibited from using artillery. After several unsuccessful attempts to persuade the Japanese in Intramuros to surrender, or at least release the numerous Filipino civilians they were holding as hostage, Griswold initiated the bombardment of the Intramuros on February the 17th, creating several breaches in the east wall. On February the 22nd, Allied artillery began targeting the north wall to breach it and eliminate a Japanese stronghold at the government mint, while additional guns took up positions for the final barrage before the infantry assault set for the following morning. Between 7:30 and 8:30 a.m. on February the 23rd, the Americans executed the last preparatory bombardment, effectively damaging the walls of the Intramuros and covering much of the interior. Once the supporting fire ceased, the infantry assault commenced with the 3rd Battalion, 129th Regiment swiftly crossing the Pasig River without any opposition, and advancing through the government mint into the Intramuros. Simultaneously, the 2nd Battalion of the 145th Regiment climbed over the breach south of the Quezon Gate and entered through the gate, unopposed, quickly moving southwest towards Letran University. 10 minutes into the assault, Griswold's artillery resumed fire for the next half hour, deploying high explosives, smoke, and white phosphorus across a 100-yard wide area between the east and west walls. This aimed to seal off the southern third of Intramuros, preventing the Japanese forces there from observing movements to the north or sending reinforcements. The total artillery and motor fire supporting the assault amounted to 230 tons, equivalent to over 11,650 rounds. By 8:50, the 129th and 145th Regiments connected at Letran University, with the 129th advancing towards Pitero Street and Fort Santiago amidst minimal resistance, while the 145th cleared Letran University and secured the first 2 blocks southwest of Quezon Gate. At 10:45, the 1st Battalion of the 145th Regiment moved through Parian Gate and headed south. As American troops pushed deeper into the Intramuros, the Japanese began to recover from the artillery bombardment, offering sporadic resistance from isolated machine gun and rifle positions. Nonetheless, the 129th successfully cleared the west wall north of Pietro Street and captured Fort Santiago in the afternoon. However, the 145th had to halt its advance about 4 blocks southwest of Quezon Gate, as the Japanese started releasing nearly 3,000 civilian hostages from San Agustin and Del Montico churches. Once the civilian evacuation was complete, American tanks and self-propelled artillery targeted Japanese positions within these churches and other strongholds in the southwestern sections of Intramuros. Despite the efforts, the troops were unable to reach the south or west walls before nightfall due to fierce resistance. Meanwhile, the 1st Squadron, 12th Cavalry, along with the 2nd Squadron, 5th Cavalry, began clearing the Southport area, facing relatively light opposition except at one strong point. Meanwhile, the 1st Squadron, 5th Cavalry, and elements of the 148th Regiment contained the enemy at the government buildings. On February the 24th, while the 129th was finishing operations at Fort Santiago, The 145th continued its offensive, successfully cornering the last pockets of resistance in the area into the aquarium, situated in a bastion at the southwest corner of Intramuros. Although the resistance was fierce in this location, a tunnel linking the bastion to the main wall was unexpectedly left unguarded, allowing Company C to break through into the aquarium with ease. The final assault commenced in the afternoon, resulting in 115 Japanese casualties as the last organized resistance within Intramuros was overcome. In total, approximately 1,000 Japanese were killed and 25 were captured during the assault on Intramuros, while the Americans suffered 25 killed with 265 wounded. Concurrently, cavalrymen completed the clearing of the Southport area and turned their attention to the government buildings, which would necessitate another intensive preparatory bombardment. The imposing columned facade of the Philippine Commonwealth's Legislative Building, the Philippine capital, fronted on the Padre Burgos Street opposite of the southeast corner of Intramuros, which lies ahead about 150 yards or so south of the City Hall. About 100 yards south of the Legislative Building was the Bureau of Finance. Another 250 yards to the southeast, near the intersection of General Luna and San Luis Street, lay the main building of the Bureau of Agriculture and Commerce. Architecturally similar to the old Senate and House office buildings in Washington, D.C., these three government structures were modern, earthquake-proof edifices constructed on heavily reinforced concrete. The oblong Legislative Building, with wings 4 stories high and a central portion rising about 2.5 floors, was constructed around 2 open courtyards. The Finance and Agricultural Buildings, both 5-story trapezoids, each featured a central courtyard. The buildings were strong not only by virtue of their construction, but because all approaches to them led across wide open ground. Sandbag emplacements and barricades of other types blocked all readily accessible doors and windows, and window-emplaced machine guns covered all approaches. Despite the fact the Japanese in the 3 buildings had advantageous positions and elevations that permitted them to endanger American and Filipino movements over large areas of Manila, the 14th Corps and the 37th Division had first considered starving the Japanese garrison out. But the 2 headquarters soon decided this would take far too long. Information from prisoners and Filipino hostages who had escaped from the buildings indicated that the Japanese garrisons in the 3 structures had sufficient strength, ammunition, food, and water to withstand a protracted siege. On February the 26th, after an hour of final artillery preparation, the 1st Battalion 148th Regiment entered the ground floor of the Legislative Building from the rear, while the 5th Cavalry attacked the Agricultural Building. However, both units were successfully repelled by determined defenders. The following day, after a failed attempt to smoke the Japanese out of the Legislative Building, heavy artillery was used to demolish the north and south wings, leaving only the damaged central section, which was subsequently cleared out by our infantry. At the same time, the 5th Cavalry cleared out the apartment buildings and several nearby structures in preparation for another attack upon the Agricultural Building, which commenced on February the 28th following a 3-hour artillery bombardment that caused significant portions of the building to collapse. Facing no initial resistance, the cavalrymen quickly assessed the remnants of the first floor, but soon encountered strong opposition from pockets of resistance at the northwest and southeast corners. With support from tanks and armed with small arms, bazookas, and portable flamethrowers, the 5th Cavalry managed to clear the above-ground debris by nightfall, although a few Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the basement areas. Ultimately, on March the 1st, after a failed appeal for surrender, demolitions along with the burning gasoline and oil eliminated the last of the Japanese resistance. During this time, artillery, tanks, and tank destroyers relentlessly bombarded the Finance Building from various angles. Eventually, the 1st Battalion of the 148th Regiment would clear the remnants of this building during their final assaults on March the 2nd and 3rd. Late on March the 3rd, Griswold joyfully informed Kruger that organized resistance in the Manila area had come to an end. The cost of reclaiming Manila was significant, with over 1,000 Americans killed and 5,500 wounded in the metropolitan area between February the 3rd and March the 3rd. But in contrast, the Japanese suffered approximately 16,000 fatalities in and around Manila. During the periods of calm in the fighting, Japanese troops often vented their anger and frustration on the city's population, committing acts of violent mutilation, rape, and massacres in schools, hospitals, and convents. This led to the deaths of at least 100,000 Filipino civilians, both from deliberate actions by the Japanese during the Manila Massacre, as it would be called, and from artillery and aerial bombardments by both American and Japanese forces. And I have to say this here, if you listened to this podcast series from the very first episode, on that first episode, I actually began with what was known as the Manila Massacre. So, as I mentioned, during the lulls in the battle for control of Manila, Japanese troops took their anger and frustration out on the civilians in the city. Violent mutilations, rapes, and massacres occurred in schools, hospitals, and convents, including San Juan de Dios Hospital, Santa Rosa College, St. Domingo Church, Manila Cathedral, Baco Church, St. Paul's Convent, St. Vincent de Paul Church, and many more places. The Bayview Hotel was designated a rape center, where more than 400 girls were rounded up at a time and raped. It was here where you would hear the most grotesque stories, such as pregnant women being bayoneted, small babies being put on bayonets, the worst things you could even imagine. And General Yamashita was convicted as a war criminal for the Manila Massacre, although there is a strong case to be made that Admiral Uribachi's Marines had committed the vast majority of the atrocities and that Yamashita had earlier ordered him to evacuate Manila. Not to defend the man, as I think everyone would argue Yamashita could have done more to protect the civilian population. But certainly, if you were to grade Yamashita against his colleagues, well, I think he did a lot better than the rest. Whether that's saying much, well, you can judge. By the end of the Battle of Manila, the public transportation system simply no longer existed. The water supply and sewage systems needed extensive repairs, the electrical power facilities did not even function, most of the streets needed repaving, and about 39 out of 100 or so large and small bridges had been completely destroyed, including 6 over the Pasig River. The University of the Philippines and the Philippine General Hospital were largely irreparable. Lower-class residential districts north of the Pasig River and the upper-class apartments south of the river had been completely destroyed. The Philippine Commonwealth's government center had been wiped out. The 400-year-old landmark of Intramuros had been nearly razed to the ground. Severe damage had been inflicted on the economically important installations in the north and south port areas, and the industrialized Paco and Patacan districts had been badly battered. Many buildings still standing would ultimately have to be torn down as they were simply unsafe for occupancy. Millions upon millions of dollars worth of damage had been done. And as I already mentioned, I think the most shocking note was the tragedy of an estimated 100,000 or so Filipino civilians having lost their lives during this battle. Mind you, that is a conservative estimate. There's estimates that go much higher. However, Manila was officially liberated, marking the end of nearly 3 years of Japanese military occupation in the Philippines. Following Manila's fall, Kruger aimed to eliminate the Shimbu and Shobu groups to finalize the liberation of Luzon. Consequently, he instructed the Sixth Army to secure southern Luzon and the Bicol Peninsula, while also ordering General Agilberto's Eighth Army to seize the islands in the Visayan Passages and the northern part of Samar. To facilitate the southern Philippines campaign, MacArthur reassigned the 40th and 41st Divisions, the 19th and 34th Regiments of the 24th Division, and the 503rd Parachute Regiment back to the Eighth Army. Additionally, he designated the 37th Division to garrison Manila. With the 43rd Division sent south to replace the 40th at Clark Field, Kruger assigned the recently arrived 33rd Division, led by Major General Percy Clarkson, to take control of the Damotes Rosario sector. Meanwhile, as the 188th Glider Regiment cleared Ternate Island, Kruger also decided to deploy the 11th Airborne Division and the 158th Regiment to secure the northern shores of the Visayan Passages and open the Batangas and Balayan Bays. However, this left only the 1st Cavalry Division and the 112th Cavalry Regiment available for operations against the Shimbo Group, leading Kruger to reluctantly redeploy the 6th Division south to reinforce the 14th Corps, leaving just the 25th, 32nd, and 33rd Divisions under the 1st Corps for operations in northern Luzon. After making these adjustments, Kruger and Griswold began strategizing their offensive eastward against General Yokoyama's Shimbo Group, which had recently received the Noguchi detachment from the Bicol Peninsula. To ensure the security and recovery of the Manila Bay area, General Patrick's 6th Division was tasked with first capturing Wawa Dam and its pipeline connections, followed by securing Ipo Dam and its related facilities, essential for meeting Manila's water needs. Meanwhile, General Hoffman's 2nd Cavalry Brigade was assigned to secure the Antipolo-Taguig region. Between February the 20th and 22nd, even before the fierce fighting in Manila began to cease, the 6th Cavalry crossed the Marikina River to take control of Taytay and then ventured to the Sierra Madre foothills. The 8th Cavalry followed suit, crossing the river to secure Taguig. On February the 23rd, the 2nd Cavalry Brigade advanced east towards Antipolo, but General Noguchi effectively utilized artillery and conducted small-scale nightly infiltration attacks, successfully harassing and delaying the cavalrymen, who would only measure their progress in feet. Noguchi's effective passive defense meant that by March the 4th, the 2nd Cavalry Brigade was still a mile and a half from Antipolo, having incurred heavy casualties during this really frustrating advance. Amongst the wounded was General Mudge, who was temporarily replaced by Hoffman as commander of the First Cavalry Division. On February the 22nd, the 6th Division was also beginning to cross the Marina River, with the 20th Regiment fording the Marina around its town, and the 63rd Regiment crossing at Montalban and San Mateo. Facing no resistance, the 20th Regiment advanced a mile into the steep, grassy hills northeast of Marina, while the 63rd probed into the high ground east of San Mateo by the evening of February the 23rd. The troops initiated an assault, and General Kobayashi's primary defenses at Mounts Pacawagan and Mataba, but made minimal progress before the 1st Regiment arrived from Batan on February the 25th. With this new information, Patrick launched a coordinated attack involving 3 regiments against the Pacawagan and Mataba. However, by March the 4th, they had only secured a tenuous foothold on the northeastern crest at Pacawagan, and the efforts of the 1st and 20th Regiments were entirely unsuccessful. Meanwhile, noticing an uptick in guerrilla activity in Bontoc and the Baguio areas, which indicated a potential major enemy offensive at Baguio, and considering the possibility of airborne assaults upon the Cagayan Valley, General Yamashita began reorganizing his forces while preparing the defenses of the triangular redoubt in northern Luzon. He kept most of the 103rd Division stationed in the Apari and Vigan sectors, assigning the 177th Independent Battalion to secure the naval base at Tuguegarao, and started organizing 8 provisional companies from the remnants of the 2nd Parachute Group at Echigu. He tasked the 10th Division while defending the Talaksek-Balat Pass sector to the last man. He gathered the remnants of the 2nd Tank Division into packs to reform the Understrength Infantry Division and relocated the 105th Division to Bagabag, where it would be bolstered by the 10th Regiment. Additionally, he assigned these 3 divisions to Major General Konuma Hario's self-sufficient Bambang branch. He transferred the 19th Division to the Bontoc area to combat the enemy guerrillas, and he tasked the Hayashi Detachment with holding San Fernando, began moving the worn-out 58th Independent Mixed Brigade north to defend Route 9, and ordered the fatigued 23rd Division to continue containing the enemy in the Rosario-Baguio sector. General Swift's 1st Corps, which had recently lost 2 divisions, was focusing its main efforts against Baguio. Clarkson's 33rd Division was set to advance along Route 11, while General Gill's 32nd Division would move northwest through the Ambayabang, Agno, and Ordogat valleys from the south and southeast. Meanwhile, General Mullen's 25th Division planned to launch a holding attack on the Bambang front. However, in mid-February, as Clarkson's forces continued to pressure Japanese troops entrenched along Hill 600 and Hill 1500's ridgelines, they learned that General Sato's withdrawal to the north was already in progress to bolster the San Fernando front. Additionally, the 130th and 136th Regiments successfully cleared the last Japanese forces from the north-central part of the ridgeline by February the 22nd, although they were unable to capture Hill 600's complex completely. At the same time, the 32nd and 25th Divisions conducted extensive patrols in their areas, discovering the Japanese were guarding every approach to the north as various units made contact with Japanese outposts. During this period, the Americans also identified the Baguio-Aritao supply road. Severing this link in the Japanese defensive network would provide the 1st Corps with a significant tactical advantage. Given that the Baguio end of the supply road was more heavily defended and that breaking through the Aritao would threaten the critical Bambang and Bagabang positions, Kruger and Swift decided that the 25th and the 32nd Divisions would concentrate their efforts on the Bambang front, while the Baguio front would be maintained in a holding capacity. Volkmann's mission, as assigned by the 6th Army, which assumed control of the USAF-FIP-NL, on January the 13th, were to gather intelligence, ambush Japanese patrols, seize or destroy Japanese supplies, disrupt Japanese lines of communication, and block Japanese routes of withdrawal into the exit from the Cagayan Valley. It was not, apparently, initially intended that Volkmann's force would engage in sustained efforts against major Japanese units, and there seems to have been little hope that Volkmann's or any other guerrilla unit would ever become effective combat organizations. The most help General MacArthur and Kruger probably expected was in the form of harassing raids, sabotage, and intelligence. But Volkmann and other guerrilla leaders on Luzon, as well, interpreted his missions as broadly as his strength and armament permitted. By the end of February, USAF-FIP-NL had cleared most of the west coast of Luzon north of San Fernando and also controlled the north coast west of Apari. Volkmann had rendered Route 11 between Baguio and Tuguegarao and Route 4 from Libtong to Bagabag virtually impassable to the Japanese. Indeed, one of the main reasons that Yamashita moved the 19th Division north had been to regain control over the 2 vital highways so that supplies could continue moving into the final redoubt. While Yusef Fitbanel did not possess significant strength to attack major Japanese concentrations or to hold out against large-scale punitive expeditions, it had diverted and pinned down Japanese forces that could undoubtedly have been used to better advantage elsewhere. It would appear that by mid-February, Yusef Fitbanel had accomplished far more than MacArthur or Kruger had expected or hoped. Meanwhile, the 121st Regiment secured the highway from Vigan south to Liptong, with Company L capturing Cervantes and pushing the 357th Independent Battalion into the Bisang Pass. Elements of the 121st then shifted their focus to San Fernando, which they attempted to attack unsuccessfully in late February and early March. Following Swift's new strategies, the 33rd Division began patrolling the approaches to Baguio in the last week of February, successfully overrunning the last Japanese positions on Hill 600 and in the Arodogat Valley. Along Route 11, the 71st Regiment executed a successful fighting withdrawal, while American patrols along the coast occupied Agu and advanced to Pugo with minimal resistance, only to encounter the first sections of the Tuba Trail defended by elements of the 64th Regiment. Over on the main front, the 25th Division commenced its advance to Pucan on February the 21st, while the 32nd Division began its push up to Villa Verde Trail towards Santa Fe. The 127th Regiment broke through the trail's outpost line on February the 24th. The 35th Regiment advanced unopposed along Route 100, reaching Caoglan on February the 26th. The 161st Regiment, targeting some high ground overlooking Puncan from the west, and successfully secured the trail junction on February the 28th, diverting the enemy's attention. And the 27th Regiment pushed north along Route number 5, facing fierce resistance while clearing the Lamboy area on February the 27th. On Villa Verde, the 127th Regiment advanced to the Cabalisan River, crossing by March the 1st, where they once again defeated the 10th Reconnaissance Regiment. After leaving one battalion to secure the crossing, the 127th continued their advance and encountered the weakened Japanese defenders on March the 3rd. Recognizing the threat to the Salaksak Pass, Konuma promptly sent reinforcements to the 10th Reconnaissance Regiment, and he ordered General Iwanaka's recently organized 2nd Tank Division to prepare for deployment to the Salaksak Pass, taking command of all the troops along the Villa Verde Trail. While these reinforcements were en route, the 127th Regiment continued to assault the remaining positions of the 10th Reconnaissance Regiment, ultimately reaching the western entrance of the Salaksak Pass on March the 5th. Meanwhile, to the south, a battalion from the 35th Regiment descended a rugged trail into Pucan from the northeast and secured the heights overlooking the damaged town on March the 1st. The next day, as patrols entered the deserted Pucan, the rest of the regiment cautiously advanced west along Route number 100, from Calaglan, occupying Dig without resistance on March the 3rd. Over the following 2 days, organized resistance began to really crumble throughout the Lumboy-Pucan area, while Mulin's 3 Regiment successfully connecting at Pucan and Dig after their encirclement of a 1,250-man enemy force. Concerned about these developments, Konuma quickly decided to bolster the 10th Division with the Takachio Unit and the majority of the 10th Regiment. Additionally, the 2nd Battalion of the 126th Regiment began its advance up the Ambayangbang Valley on February the 25th, successfully reaching Luacan by March the 5th. In response to this new threat, Yamashita swiftly directed his reserve 16th Reconnaissance Regiment to secure the upper reaches of the Abayambang. Finally, to the south, the Americal and 24th Divisions were tasked with initiating operations to secure the Visayan passages. Consequently, on February the 19th, the 1st Battalion of the 182nd Regiment landed on Kapul Island and launched an assault on the Biri Island the next day. After discovering other unoccupied islets near Samar, the battalion established a base at the northwestern tip of Samar, ultimately defeating the last organized resistance in the region by March the 1st. Meanwhile, elements of the 19th Regiment landed at the Verde Island on February the 23rd, managing to secure the island by March the 3rd. The 1st Battalion of the 21st Regiment made an unopposed landing on Lubang Island on February the 28th, and the 1st Battalion of the 132nd Regiment successfully captured Takao in the Burias Islands on March the 3rd. Additionally, on the morning of February the 23rd, a task force comprising the 1st Battalion of the 188th Glider Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the 511th Parachute Regiment, a provisional reconnaissance platoon from the 11th Airborne Division, several guerrilla groups led by Lieutenant Colonel Honorio Guerrero, along with supporting artillery, tank destroyers, and amphibious tractors, executed a carefully coordinated rescue of over 2,147 internees from an internment camp near Los Banos and Laguna del Bay. The 1st Battalion of the 188th Glider Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Soule, launched a diversionary ground attack from the west, while the majority of the 1st Battalion of the 511th Parachute Regiment crossed the Laguna del Bay using amphibious tractors. Company B of the 511th Parachute Regiment parachuted directly into the camp and the reconnaissance platoon, along with the guerrillas who had already infiltrated the area, created chaos throughout the camp. The task force eliminated the Japanese garrison of about 250 guards and managed to escape through enemy-held territory before the Fuji force could mount a counterattack. The casualties were quite minimal. Only 3 Americans and 2 Filipinos lost their lives, while 2 Americans and 4 Filipinos were injured. However, starting 2 nights after the raid, the 17th Regiment, along with the Kempeitai Police and Filipino Ganaps, began terror raids in the surrounding barrios, resulting in the deaths of up to 1,500 Filipino civilians over the next few nights. Yet that is it for the Philippines for today, as we now need to return to New Guinea to talk about the ongoing Australian campaign in the Aitape-Wewak area. Previously, Brigadier Marne's 19th Brigade had fought its way to Malin and Ambao, while Colonel Buttroses and, yes, that is a very unfortunate last name, 2 and 5th Battalion secured Parambil, Asiling, Samisa, and Maringi. On January the 12th, Brigadier Mon directed the battalion to initiate a 3-pronged offensive towards Luati, Bolamida, and Bombissima. The advance was rapid, as patrols encountered only small enemy groups, and all 3 objectives were successfully captured by the end of January. After the capture of Malin, the 2 and 8th Battalion and the 2 and 9th Commando Squadron patrolled the rugged terrain between Nimbum Creek and the upper Danmap for 3 weeks, facing some resistance on Long Ridge. Due to this pressure, General Otsu's force received additional reinforcements in the later half of January before withdrawing to join the defenses of the 20th Division, while General Mano's 41st Division retreated to Balif and Salada. Meanwhile, General Stevens had ordered Brigadier Roy King's 16th Brigade to relieve the 19th at Danmap, but catastrophic floods hindered the completion of this relief in the south before the month ended. Over in the north, the 2 and 1st Battalion took over for the 2 and 11th Battalion on January the 24th, and they began advancing patrols along the Nambut Hill, where they faced significant resistance. Due to these patrols, the Australians launched a company attack on February the 4th, which the defenders easily repelled. Following a heavy air bombardment, the enemy stronghold was captured on February the 7th, and another company took McNeil's Creek 4 days later. Meanwhile, the 2 and 3rd Battalion initiated an assault on Long Ridge, inflicting considerable casualties on the enemy at Corey Spur. At this juncture, Stevens decided to sequentially capture Butt, Dagao, and Wewak, as well as Mount Prick in the mountains, and to push eastwards. The 16th Brigade was first to advance to Wank Creek, which, God knows how it got that nickname, and then to Adnab River. King promptly sent the 2 and 1st Battalion to secure Nambut Creek, while the 2 and 3rd Battalion moved to the Wolhook Creek-Una Creek line. By February the 18th, the 2 and 1st Battalion had finally secured Nambut Hill, with one company advancing along the coast and pushing the Japanese across the creek the very next day. By February the 22nd, the area of Balam Creek was occupied, and barges had delivered supplies at Wank Creek for 4 days. The following day, they reached the Adnab River and began patrolling towards Sowam, while a sloop bombarded enemy positions along the coast. Finally, on February the 28th, the 2 and 2nd Battalion relieved the weary 2 and 1st Battalion and started preparing for operations against Butt. Simultaneously, the 2 and 3rd Battalion successfully established the Wolhook Creek-Una Creek line and sent patrols northwards to connect with both the 2 and 1st and 2 and 2nd Battalions. In early February, the 2 and 5th Battalion launched an attack on Salada, Balif, and Balaga, sending 3 companies southwards. Salada, Bombeda were captured on February the 3rd, followed by Balif 3 days later, while Balaga remained successfully defended. The 2 and 6th Cavalry Commando Regiment was tasked with supporting Mullen's advance towards Mapik, prompting the 2 and 10th Commando Squadron to move to Ami. After the Australians secured the Balaga-Namango area on February the 13th, Buttrose dispatched 2 companies to capture Baranga, Bandangi, and Malahun, which fell by February the 17th. At this time, the 2 and 10th Commando Squadron had also advanced northeast of Ami to Welahuda, Kulagyam, and Amurhar, resulting in several Japanese casualties. Meanwhile, the 2 and 7th Commando Squadron conducted patrols deep into the Atab River and the headwaters of the Screw River. I would imagine Wank Creek is near Screw River. The 2 and 5th Battalion was prepared for relief by the 2 and 7th Battalion, but first needed to fend off a strong counterattack at Malahun on February the 23rd. During the 2 and 5th's advance, most of the 4th Division withdrew south into the densely populated garden area bordering by the Nanu and the Amuk rivers. This southern flank could not be overlooked as the Australians moved towards Maprik, so Mullen sent a company from the 2 and 6th Battalion to advance through Membras, Asinkor, Unabinakor, and then east to the heavily fortified Sinoha villages, pushing the enemy towards Maprik for destruction. Additionally, a rumor was spread amongst the locals that the commandos would advance on Maprik via Ami. which successfully prompted the Japanese to reposition most of their forces to the north and northeast. Meanwhile, by early March, the 2 and 7th Battalion had completed the relief of the 2 and 5th Battalion and successfully occupied Asanakor on March the 7th, followed by Nimbi on March the 8th, Ubanakor on March the 9th, and Balanga, Badabil, Ilahop, and Armimin on March the 10th. To the north, the 2 and 2nd Battalion also finished its relief at the Anub. Additionally, the 2 and 3rd Machine Gun Battalion and the 2 and 9th Commando Squadron took over from the 2 and 3rd Battalion in the mountainous region. They later began advancing towards Oremi on March the 4th, where they encountered a strong Japanese force that resisted for about 3 days. After significant airstrikes, the Australians managed to clear the area west of the Anub River by March the 9th. Simultaneously, the 2 and 2nd Battalion pushed forward to Simbo Creek, successfully clearing the area and reaching the Ninahua River by March the 12th. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. I have a rather silly episode that's recently come out covering the French-Indian War of all things. Also, it's me and my friends talking about Canadian propaganda in the form of us remembering an old show called Canada, A People's History. If you're a Canadian and you remember that show, well, it's a lot of fun to talk about it. If you want to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, you get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The battle for Manila is finally over. The capital of the Philippines came at a terrible cost for the Americans, the Japanese, and most certainly the innocent Filipino civilians. It would be only a matter of time until the Americans mopped up the Philippines and continued onwards to the Japanese home islands.